Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with the first I don't know, episode, segment, thing of our monthly book club thing, which has no official name. And I'm thinking now as I'm saying it, I should have some kind of name. But for those of you who aren't aware that I had a book club, I'll have a little impromptu like book club thing, which I started with my close out what's coming up, whatever we're calling it, video from 2023 to 2024, where I talked about how sort of my goal this year is to read a different Greek retelling every single month for the year. And if you guys wanted to join me, you could, and some people did. And it's still open to join. You can join anytime you want. You can pick and choose what books you want to read. If you want to read with me, if you don't, that's totally cool too. But here it is. This is the first one. The first book that we are reading is Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. I finished it, so now I'm going to tell you my thoughts about it, and then, we'll go from there and see what happens. For those of you who are reading along and would like to continue book club exploration and conversation, send me a message on Instagram, and I will create a group chat for everybody who's reading along so that we can have, like, a book club meeting type thing, a meeting place where everyone can share their thoughts and feelings and their opinions and stuff on the book on Instagram. So message me there. My info is down below in the description box. If you are not familiar with where to get my Instagram handle from, it's there. And that's what I'll do. So send me a message. Be like, hey, I want to be in the conversation, and I will pop you into the conversation, and we'll have a little continuation of book club there, which I think will be really fun. And I will try to think of some stuff that we can do there as like a group to just make this whole experience more fun. Those of you who messaged me to tell me that you were reading along, thank you. I'm so excited for this. You don't even know. I thought about a couple of different ways to do this, but I think what I'm going to do is keep this as a regular book review. So I'm going to share my thoughts about the book here in this video, and then any further conversation will happen in that little book club group chat, as opposed to having like an open conversation with my entire YouTube, because not everybody on my YouTube is in the book club. It would be cool if they were, but they're not. So that's what it is. And then, like I said, if you would like to join, if you missed this month, if you want to join next month, totally join in. You could join any time, and you don't have to read every single book. You can read some of the books if you're not interested in reading every single book, and just, have fun and hang out with us, and we'll read and we'll talk about some cool stuff that we read. So I think what I'm going to do is split this into two parts. The first part will just be my non-spoiler review, and then I'll do the spoilers and like all my in-depth thoughts and feelings about it after that. So I'll give you guys a little spoiler warning, and then for those of you who are not in the book club but want to hear about the book, you can stay and watch the whole video. You can just listen to the recap that doesn't have any spoilers. That's totally chill too. And then for those of you who would like to join into the next one, if you didn't join into this one, or if you are currently in the club and you would like to continue being in the club, next month we are going to be reading Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara. So that's going to be next month's book. I wanted to get that up front for those of you who aren't staying for the entirety of the video. So that's what we're reading next month. But right now we're talking about Atalanta. So here we go. So I love this book. I would give this book like 4.5 golden apples. I actually really, really love this book. I have some very strong like critiques of it, some criticisms, but I usually have criticisms of things that I like. So like that's how I review things when I think about stuff. I'm really critical of it. But I really enjoyed this book. I think my favorite thing about this book is that, one, Atalanta is presented as a strong female character with flaws. And on top of that, the book has sort of how she navigates in a world that's mostly run by men. And it's a very like feminist forward book without being anti-men. And I really appreciate that too, because feminism is equality, not superiority. So like that was a really interesting point to me in the story. And I thought that she really walked the line. Jennifer Saint really like walked the line on getting that point across without trying to come across as super superior. And not to say that like Atalanta doesn't have her struggles with that thought process. But like I said, she's a flawed character who's also a very strong female protagonist. And that's really great. So this covers Atalanta's childhood, her journey on the Argo, and then her subsequent like story thereafter. If you have not heard of the myth of Atalanta, I haven't done it on my channel, so I can't link you to it. I will eventually at some point. So eventually, we'll get to it. But if you haven't, go look it up. If you're familiar with it, then you'll kind of know where this story goes. It follows that pretty closely to the myth. But all in all, I thought this was a really well written book. I listened to it as an audiobook, and I can't remember the narrator's name off the top of my head. I should have looked at that before I started recording. But she did a really good job. She was not like hard to listen to. She was, she was a really good narrator. So if you're like me and you're of the words are really hard, of the neurodivergent variety, where sometimes listening is easier than actually sitting down to read, I would recommend the audiobook for sure. I enjoyed the narrator immensely, and I think that she has sort of a quiet like presence in the way that she narrated Atalanta. It gave her like sort of a very soft but recognizably feminine strength that came through in her words. Like, it was very stoic but not like boring. So I really enjoyed that as well. Probably my major criticism, not my only criticism, my major criticism is the amount of time spent with Jason and the Argonauts on the quest for the Golden Fleece. That killed me. It killed my soul entirely. Not that it ruined the book experience for me. I enjoyed every single chapter. Like, I'm telling you guys right now, I enjoyed every single chapter, and I wasn't struggling to get to the end of the book or anything like that, but I had to keep checking to be like, how much longer are we going to be in this part? Because it was so long. It was so long. But it, like, surprisingly did not ruin the experience. It did not make me go like, oh my God, I can't finish this book because we've been here forever. I was just like, why are we still here? And that leads to some of my criticisms, which I'll talk about into the spoilery section, but I wanted you guys to know that's the part that I was really struggling with when it comes to this book, which is why it doesn't get like the full 5 stars, because there's a lot of time with those guys, and I could have lived with less time. But otherwise, like I said, I really enjoyed this book. I think it's really good. I really appreciate Atalanta as a character. I really appreciate the way that she sort of navigates not only being a woman in this like male-run climate, but also having to deal with the gods and their temperaments, and the way that like the interactions between gods and mortals are sort of like portrayed here as like a very real, very living thing, but also something that's a little bit chaotic, and I'll go into that in spoilers, of course. But the relationship and the way that she has to navigate those and sort of absorb that knowledge on how the gods treat mortals was a really interesting little bit of insight, and I really liked that idea, liked seeing that concept. So all in all, this was a really good book. I really enjoyed it. It's about 11 hours of listening, so not too bad at all. And like I said, I didn't struggle listening to it. I didn't even have to speed it up, which was surprising, and if you know me, that's saying something, because that means the narrator was good. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book. Let me know if you have read it, what you thought in the comments below. If you are reading it with me, jump over to the discussion. We'll talk about it over there. But now I'm going to jump into spoilers. So if you do not want to know spoilers for this story, get out of here. Go read it and then come back and listen to my spoiler review. But leave for right now. So the story itself starts out in spoiler. I can't warn you more. The story starts out with Atalanta literally from birth forward, which was really interesting to me. I thought that like it would probably start after she had like been incorporated into Artemis's like little group and then go from there, but literally it starts birth onward. And those beginning few chapters where they're like setting up her story and how she grows into being this amazing like huntress and stuff like that were fine for opening chapters. I really don't have a lot to say about them. I didn't have a lot of strong opinions on them. The only thing that I thought really stood out to me in those early chapters was her relationship with the other nymphs and the other people in like Artemis's little girl gang. Including Callisto. I think she really like looked up to Callisto, and then watching the downfall of Callisto for something that was beyond her control because of how rigid the temperament of Artemis is in the story. And I thought that was really interesting. It's also very reflective of the myth. So when I say in the story, I don't mean just like she only does it in this book and doesn't happen anywhere else. It happens like this in the mythology too. But there's sort of this interesting conversation on how she sort of idolizes Artemis and then is sort of taken aback every time Artemis does something that like a god does, which would be punitive. two mortals who like disobey her set of rules. And her rules are kind of arbitrary because they're distinctly set to her and they don't have any room for leeway, which I thought was really interesting because a lot of the gods are like that. Like they're very inflexible in the set of like standard rules that they have for themselves. Meanwhile, mortals are like more fluid and like fluctuating. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of thing because Artemis's rules don't change, but Atalanta through the course of the story was able to sort of girl logic her way through some of the things to sort of bend those rules or be like, it doesn't matter because like I have thought this thought loophole. So she was able to be more flexible in her thinking, whereas the gods are sort of rigid and structured in their thinking. And then there's a whole conversation, sort of like a smaller side story, backstory about the relationship between Artemis and Persephone and Aphrodite, and how like Aphrodite getting in between her friendship with Persephone has sort of caused this rivalry between her and Aphrodite, and Artemis like has not gotten past that, and so because of that seems to be a little bit even more like strict in her punishment of the people who disobey her rules because she's so afraid of losing more people she cares about. So like when it comes down to the nymph that couldn't get away from the river creek deity, I don't remember what it was. She turns her into a spring and puts her on an island that's sacred to her. It is like, well, that's her bad for not being fast enough to get away when, like, she knows that not every single person in her retinue, especially the new people, are going to be as proficient at, like athletics and, being badass huntresses, basically, in getting away from sort of obstacles like that. So she knew that already, but she didn't care because it was like, how dare you fail in front of me? And that was a really interesting thing. And then when Callisto's assault happens, Callisto tries to like cover it up and hide it because she knows exactly how serious the punishment's going to be when Artemis finds out. But she never leaves, which I thought was really interesting because had Callisto just chosen to leave, she would have saved herself the punishment of being turned into a bear. And if you're not familiar with Callisto's story, she ends up dying anyways. After she's a bear, after she has her cub, and Zeus ends up putting her and the child in the sky as Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. So that's where they come from. So they end up as constellations. So I guess, like, in some ways she gets a bit of reprieve from being cursed to a life as a bear, but, like, the punishment is so insanely harsh. And it's such an interesting thing to me because Artemis is, considerably the champion of women, champion of independence, that kind of thing. But she doesn't have any flexibility when it comes to being a victim. And that was like one of those things that I think was really interesting to explore through the eyes of Atalanta, because Atalanta worships Artemis, like, who wouldn't? If you were in her retinue, you would absolutely look up to the goddess, right? So she's looking up to her, and then she sees like how harshly she deals out these punishments to people she's supposed to care about. And what's interesting to me is that although it does sort of shake her opinion, it doesn't shake her, like, her trust in Artemis, like her absolute dedication to. She's absolutely dedicated as she was when she started. That doesn't change, but it does sort of shake up her foundation a little bit and put the fear of the goddess into her, which I thought was really interesting. And that's basically what happens in the first part of the story. And you sort of see this, and then you get to hear a little bit about the story between Artemis and Aphrodite and how they're sort of battling each other with these, like, different like encounters over mortal lives, immortal lives, those sort of things. Okay, I had to sneeze and drink some coffee. So in the second and third parts, we're basically following the entirety of Atalanta's journey with Jason and the Argonauts. And the first part of that is the journey to Colchis. And I think it's really interesting, like her encounters with Meleager and Peleus too. Like, both of those guys really stood out to me. Obviously, they were meant to stand out to me, but the way that she's being perceived by different men when she joins their group is really interesting to me, but also the way that each of the Argonauts are portrayed, especially the ones that get, like, front and center and not the background guys. Because Meleager seems to be, like, the most receptive to having a woman in their midst right off the bat, because he's immediately impressed by her right out of the gate when she outruns him, like, while he's carrying a deer, which I was like, he's carrying a deer, girl, give him a chance, but she didn't, which I respect her for that because she has the skill. But he also admits that, like, even if he wasn't carrying the deer, he wouldn't have been able to catch up to her when they were running towards the harbor town that they were departing from. but she never seen men before, like in a greater context. She meets Hippomenes one time in Artemis's forest when he gets attacked by centaurs, and that's like her first encounter with a man. And then she goes out on this quest to join the Jason and the Argonauts to win glory for Artemis. And right out of the gate she encounters Meleager, and he's like, huh, okay, all right, I'm gonna see where this goes. I'm intrigued. I'm interested. And she's like, okay, cool. Like, this is how I expect to be received. And then as she encounters the rest of the Argonauts, and they're like, hell no, we don't want you here. Ick, women, ick, your knees. We can see them. Gross. She's like, wow, okay, I was not prepared for this reception. And then that's the point where I realized, as we had watched her childhood, one, we already knew she didn't encounter any men, but nobody prepared her to like encounter men. All she knows is like the stories she's heard from other people, the little bit she got about Zeus from Callisto's like encounter, and that's it. Like, just nobody was like, hey, sometimes guys will kind of suck. She went in there thinking fully that she's going to show up, she's going to be Artemis's champion, and everything's going to be okay. They're going to be like, oh yeah, totally, of course, you're Artemis's champion. Maybe a little bit of pushback, but like she wasn't prepared for the amount of pushback she was going to get. And I love the quiet fury that's written into her lines when she's talking, basically to herself about, the way that these men are looking at her and viewing her. And she's got like all the rage because she's like, they don't even know what I can do. Like, fuck these guys. And that like really echoed home for me. Because, I think we can all at least think of one point in time, especially as women or people who identify as women, where we showed up to somewhere and we were immediately underestimated because of the status of our sex and not because of anything else. Like, there was no other defining factor, no other quality that had people immediately looking down on us. They just immediately did it. And then like the way that she expresses like her rage silently is something that really echoed. And I was like, okay, I really feel that really deep down. And then when she encounters Jason, what I thought was interesting is that there's all these like heroes there, right? They're all there to like go on the journey of the Argonauts. But she meets Jason and she's like, this guy's just a fucking kid. And like at that point I was like, how old is Atalanta? Because I couldn't figure it out. I thought she was like also the same age as Jason, but she's a little bit older in fact. And she's kind of surprised by how young Jason is in comparison to all these other like great heroes, because Jason is like essentially untested at this point. And I thought that was a really interesting thing for her to point out, but also for her to like remark on. And then it sort of shifted my opinion on the mythology of Jason and the Argonauts a little bit, because I never really considered how young he was at the time of the journey of the Argonauts. Like I didn't really consider that. But essentially the first part of that, like part two, is the entire journey to Colchis and sort of the interaction she's having there. I really love the moment where Peleus is sort of bragging about how he got his wife by not letting her go, and like Atalanta's listening to the story and she's like, wow, disgusting, gross, but she doesn't say anything. And this is like where I thought it was really interesting, because she's outspoken for herself and quick to react in cases where people are sort of boxing her in, but she's also very careful with how she speaks. And this is one of those moments where I was like, you could have said something. You could have said anything here. They would have probably like talked her down, shit on everything she said once she opened her mouth, and she knew that. But like, I feel like she could have said something, and this was like the first indication to me that Atalanta, while being a strong, independent female character, is not a girl's girl. The second indication came to me when she hooked up with Meleager, knowing full well he had a wife, and that drove me insane. I was like, you don't even want to ask him, like, what about your wife? No, she never did. She never asked, because she just assumed that they would hook up and he would go back home to his wife and everything would be fine. And there would be no further questions, no problems. This is incense smoke. It's not, my house is not on fire, guys, don't worry. I like to light incense for insight before I start doing stuff like this. But like, she never asked him, and that drove me insane. Like, the entire time they were hooking up, I was like, just ask about his wife. Just ask, because he's gonna have some kind of feelings at the end of this like scenario, and you're gonna have to respond. And if you never ask about his wife, you're never gonna get like the right, or the you're not gonna have the right amount of information to respond. And she doesn't. So like, when it comes down to it, at the end of it, when he's like, I would leave my wife for you, she's like, no, I'm not interested. I didn't even really consider that would be an option. I thought you would just go back home to your wife. And I was like, imagine if you had just freaking asked him about his wife at any point. So that's where I was like, okay, so Atalanta is a very strong female character. She's not a girl's girl, which is very interesting because that's sort of a thing that's echoed in Artemis in the story, because Artemis doesn't look out for the girls that are like victimized. She punishes them for being victimized. And I thought that was like something interesting, like something that she had picked up from her interactions with the goddess, where she was like, I'm not interested in like these other women and these other things because I'm here for me and me alone. And when I'm no longer being served by this, I will leave or remove myself from the situation. And you see her do that several times throughout the story, where she's like, okay, this doesn't serve me anymore. Time to go. So I thought it was interesting. That's where I found like the biggest flaw in her character, which made me like frustrated, but I didn't hate her as a character, because I was like, okay, like she has to have some kind of flaw. This isn't my favorite flaw for her to have. I wish she was more of a girl's girl, but it's a flaw that she has, and I like when characters have flaws, when they're complex. So it still worked for me as a whole, but I was like, God, just fucking ask him about his wife like one time, please. The entire journey to Colchis was basically like mini adventure, micro adventures. They lose Hercules at some point, which is okay. That happens in the same story. Poor Hylas, though. Like, he did not deserve that fate. His mythology is the same, too. He gets dragged under by nymphs who are so enamored by his beauty that they have to take him. Some of the versions of the story say that he lives, like, forever with them underneath the water, and others just say that they dragged him under and he died, and they just keep his body down there, which is also sad and depressing. I thought that the way that Hercules was written, or Heracles was written, was really interesting. Because he's sort of written in that, like, larger-than-life, sort of great, boorish, oafish kind of man with, like, more strength than brains. But he had, like, these really interesting, subtle nuances where he was, like, not completely misogynistic like other members of the Argonauts were. He just wasn't interested. Like, he didn't care about Atalanta. He was like, I don't care how much you can do because I'm the son of Zeus and therefore the most powerful among us, so it doesn't really matter. Nobody here matches me, even you. But he also wasn't, like, embracing her as, like, an equal either. He was just like, okay, you're here and that's fine. It doesn't matter because I'm here. So, like, it was a really interesting thing to see him written in that way. I have sort of a weird sympathy, like, heartstring for, like, the story of Heracles. And I want to do, like, the story of his labors on my channel at some point. So I was hoping that he'd be written a little bit more sympathetically, but I think, like, the way that he was written is still true to type. And I thought it was just a really interesting sort of play, because you're looking at two really powerful, like, warriors, people who are, like, above and beyond the rest of the group there, and how they're interacting with each other. And Heracles' like chosen interaction was to ignore and, like, be like, I don't even care about you. You're here, so, like, I'll acknowledge you, but I don't care about you. Meanwhile, like, Atalanta's whole thing was like, I want to be acknowledged and I want you guys to recognize me. And Heracles was like, I don't need the recognition. I'm already fucking famous. Like, that's fine. So I thought that was interesting. I also thought it was really interesting to watch how angry Heracles became when he failed due to, like, a complication with the equipment. Like, the amount of, like, toxic masculinity and rage that came through when the oar broke during the rowing competition. Was really interesting to me, and I was like, wow, okay, like, that's a normal, like, reaction of, like, pent up toxic, like, masculinity rage. Because he didn't lose based on, like, his merit. He lost because the equipment failed, and he could have argued that point and been like, hey, I need a new oar and then we're gonna finish this. But because he broke, like, the oar broke, he lost his shit and sort of ruined the whole day for everybody, and nobody wanted to brag about how they won because the fucking oar broke, and he got so mad. So those were just sort of, like, moments, I guess, that stood out to me in that first part. Also, the part where they're going through the clashing rocks, and Atalanta has to, like, sneak off afterwards to sort of deal with her feelings. It's the first time that she feels, like, true fear and anxiety. So she literally just had, like, a huge panic attack. She's never experienced that before. It's the first time that, like, her skill as a huntress didn't matter in sort of how she engages with the world, because that was sort of up to chance, and she was not prepared for that, that encounter to be that way. And it really rocked her. So I thought it was just really interesting to watch her sort of process the panic in that chapter. and the aftermath of that, like having to deal with feeling that kind of fear for the first time, was really interesting because, again, it humanizes her a bit more. And it's not like a negative flaw in her character, just a flaw in her character where she has to deal with this and doesn't have the processing skills to do so. And so I just really appreciated that. I thought it was really genuine, very true. And the way that she deals with it is probably the way I would deal with it if I was in the same situation. I would absolutely go hide and go fucking take a nap somewhere because I don't know what to do. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then when we get into part 3, they make it to Colchis, and they get to the point where they're almost about to have the fleece, and Jason is like required to actually do something himself for once. And I really enjoyed sort of the side moments where they're sort of just sitting on the sidelines watching everything go down and getting progressively frustrated, because basically what Jason did was gather all these heroes to come help him do this quest, and none of them were actually needed, because when they got there, the king was like, just you do this. And then even then he didn't even achieve that because Medea did freaking everything. So let's talk about Medea for a second. Okay, so Medea is presented as a foil to Atalanta's character. She's traditionally beautiful. She has traditional values. The only thing that, like, separates her from, like, typical women of ancient Greece, and I don't know where they are. They're not in Greece when they're in Colchis. Colchis is, like, closer to Turkey, I think, on the map. I looked it up while I was reading and then forgot to, like, remember. But I think it's closer to, like, Syria and Turkey than it is to actual Greece. But, like, the thing that sets her apart from traditional, like, Grecian women, or even women of that time in any region, is that she is a priestess of Hecate. She has some sort of, like, skill with magical, like, witchery, ability, power things. And she's freaking ruthless. Okay? And that's something I thought was really interesting, because her like, sense of ethics is entirely different from Atalanta's. And so at first you're like, oh, okay, she's gonna be, like, a normal girl, and sort of that's the foil we're looking at here, like normal girl versus like wild huntress girl. And that's not the case. The case isn't like Atalanta's physical prowess versus Medea's like feminine charms and wiles, which she uses, but it's the fact that her moral compass, like Medea's, is so different and wildly skewed that Atalanta doesn't know how to navigate it, because it doesn't make any sense to her. Also, she finds Medea to be really disarming in the way that, not like her being a woman is disarming, but it's the fact that all these men are suddenly on board with everything Medea says. They're listening to her. They're doing the things that she's saying. They're following her instructions. She's calling the shots, and they're like, yeah, absolutely, okay. But, like, Atalanta's been on that trip the whole time, and she still has to deal with the misogyny. She still has to deal with them talking down to her, with them, like, basically treating her, like, in a predatory way, the way that, like, Peleus is treating her. But when Medea shows up, they're like, yeah, totally, yes, ma'am, no problems. Like, all the things are fine. No questions to ask or anything like that. And she's like, what the heck? And, that's the part that's really disarming to Atalanta, and I thought it was really interesting. I don't care for Medea's character in the book. I wish they had written her just a little bit differently, but I think we're not supposed to really care for Medea's character in the book, because she sort of portrays herself as, like, this innocent, naive girl who's just trying to escape her home, and then the second she does manage to get a little bit of freedom, she murders her brother. Like, that's sort of the thing where you're like, oh, and then, like, she goes to her Aunt Circe's, home to get the whole purification ritual done so that they can move on and be happy. And I'm like, well, isn't that freaking convenient? Like, you just happen to know somebody on the way home who can help clean up this mess that you started for yourself. But she continues to call the shots, and it gets to a point where her and Atalanta are having a conversation, because she pulls Atalanta off the ship to go help her, like, prepare for her wedding night, basically. And Atalanta's like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, that's a really interesting thing, because Medea took no time to, like, learn or understand anything about Atalanta. She just went, you're a lady, so therefore you should help me do this thing. And then while they're in this cave having this conversation, I think that's when Medea realizes that she didn't need to pull Atalanta, because Atalanta had nothing to offer her. Not even, like, the solidarity of women among women, because Atalanta can't understand where she's coming from. She can't, like, see why she would make the choices she makes, because to Atalanta, if you have magical powers, you have this ability to sort of solve all these problems for this guy, you should be able to do everything on your own. You don't need to get married or settle down. But to Medea, there's only one course, and that's to sort of set herself up for the best path in life by marrying the hero Jason, whom she doesn't realize at this point in the story has actually nothing, like no claim to anything. Like, he's hoping to have a claim when he gets home, but nobody knows. Like, she doesn't know, he doesn't know. No one really knows what's going to happen when they get back there, to the point where some of the Argonauts are expecting to have to fight once they get back home. But Medea doesn't know that. She put all of her faith into Jason based on the notoriety of his name and the, like, scale of this quest, and is hoping that that's going to set her up for a better place in life. So that's why she's making all these choices, helping this man do all these things. And I think it's really interesting. I thought Medea's character, like the way that she played against Atalanta, was really interesting. I also like just the fact that Atalanta can't at any point understand Medea's motivations, which makes her distrust her. It's not that she's like another girl in the midst. It's that she doesn't understand her motivations. So the whole time she's like, why are we listening to this woman? She just showed up. Like, what the heck? I thought Jason was in charge. And they're like, yeah, he is. But then they keep taking like the calls from Medea because she hasn't steered them wrong at any point. And it's hard to argue that. Because they managed to get the fleece because of her. They managed to get away from Colchis because of her. Like, they did all these things because of Medea. And Medea really just sort of takes over this whole thing. And Jason lets her because he's a young man who can't decide anything and bounces from one, like, situation to the other. Because there's a point, I think it's Lemnos is the island, when in the first, in part 2, when they go to the island of Lemnos and all the women are there, they murdered all their husbands. That's a whole thing. I didn't spend any time on that, but they murdered all their husbands because their husbands were treating them like shit because they didn't offer the right, offerings to Aphrodite. So Aphrodite made them all stinky, and the guys were like, we're gonna go find a bunch of slave women instead of our stinky wives at home. And so all the wives murdered them, and then eventually the stink went away, and now they're just a bunch of women on an island who need to find some men to like breathe new life into their home, sometimes literally. But while they're there, the queen of the island sort of offers her hand in marriage to Jason, and Jason's like, yeah, totally, when I get back, I'm gonna marry you. And then he meets Medea, who's a younger, more available person who helped him achieve his quest, and he's like, yeah, I'm totally gonna marry you. Like, the boy doesn't know what he wants. He just bounces around to whatever's freaking convenient, which, if you are familiar with the story of Jason and Medea after the Argo like expedition, he does that again, and it goes horribly wrong for him the third time. So, like, the man never knows what he wants and just continues to bounce from one opportunity to the other, and it turns out to be a tragedy by the end of it. But because of this, like, behavior, like, Atalanta can't follow this train of thought. She doesn't understand why Jason would do this. She doesn't understand why Medea would do this. And she finds it to be very disarming. Also, it takes all the adventure, all the wind out of her sails and some of the other Argonauts when essentially Medea did all the work. And they're now just sailing home with the spoils of, like, Medea's labor. And they didn't get to do any fighting. They didn't get to do any adventuring. They weren't part of the the obtaining of the fleece. And she's like, what the heck? What was this for? Like, there's no glory here for us because Medea did everything and we're just basically taking credit for her work, which is an interesting thing for her to get hung up on, because after they get back home and everybody goes their separate ways, she finds out from Hippomenes, the guy that she saw in the woods, because he tracks her down eventually. She finds out from Hippomenes that they're basically telling the story of Jason and the Argonauts without her. They're like, that girl didn't do anything, she wasn't there. And they're basically writing her out of the story. And she's like, what the heck? I did so much. Like, I saved so many lives. I did stuff during this thing. And they're just erasing me from the story because men are doing men things. And they don't do that to Medea in the story, but she doesn't really focus on that. But I thought it was interesting that, like, it doesn't come up to her like, what happened to Medea? They still tell Medea's part in the story, but they try to erase Atalanta's, even though Medea showing up sort of eliminated their chance for, like, ultimate glory the way that they were envisioning it during their journey. So when they get home from the journey from obtaining the Golden Fleece, she joins Meleager, who she's been sleeping with this entire time. She joins Meleager to go on a quest to his home to hunt down this boar. And this is where, like, my biggest criticisms of the story begin, is that as I was listening to this book, the book is like 11 hours, almost 11 hours. We spent about 6.5 hours on this journey with Jason and the Argonauts, which means the rest of the story is about 4 hours, 4.5 hours. of her childhood and then the end of the story. And when we get back from the trip of the Argo, it really goes like the pace of the story starts to pick up dramatically to sort of cover this wide swath of time, because it's years of time in the last part of the book. And it skips right through like as fast as possible to hit all the highlights to end the book. And that's where I was like, if the journey of the Argo had been shorter, we could have spent more time on her life afterwards and sort of gradually feeling our way through these things. And I'm going to express why I feel like the last part of the book should have been a little bit longer or a little bit meatier. And I feel like if you read the book, you know that section of the Argonaut's journey could have been reduced by just a little bit. Not a lot of it, but a little bit. Because she goes on this trip with Meleager to go hunt the boar, in the Caledonian boar, and when they get there, they're joined by like the other dudes that are there, some other heroes that also wanted to get some fame and whatever, but also Meleager's uncles. And essentially what happens is during this whole thing, when they're fighting the boar, some people die, and then Atalanta manages to hit the first blow on the boar and actually injure it, because everything they had been throwing at the boar was just sort of glancing off of its like hide, and they couldn't like damage it, they couldn't get any blood. And because she's able to finally strike the boar, it's sort of like the whatever invulnerability and penetrability thing sort of washes away, and Meleager is able to kill the boar finally. So because he kills the boar, he gets to decide what happens with the prize of the boar. So he dedicates the hide and the tusk to Atalanta for drawing first blood, which is traditional, like a traditional custom and expected, because she did do the thing. She did the thing. But what happens is Meleager's uncles, who are the like epitome of toxic masculinity, are so offended that he would offer it to a woman, even though they did nothing to contribute to the death of this boar in the way that Atalanta did, and not to them. Like, he offers it to Atalanta instead of them, and they're so offended that they tried to kill Atalanta for this. And this is like the disconnect, and I was like, whoa, wow, what an escalation. I wish we had spent like one more chapter in this like relationship between all these people, because even though I know that is the mythology, like I know that is her story, it happened so quickly that you're like, what the fuck? What is going on? Because you don't really get to establish the uncles as a character because of how quickly the story is moving at this point. And I would have liked a little bit more time to just see how like toxic they were, because they weren't happy that Atalanta was there by any means when they showed up, but they didn't really say much about it. They just kind of scoffed at her and made ugly faces at her, and then all of a sudden they're trying to murder her for something Meleager does. And at this point, like, Meleager has already declared his love for Atalanta. She's already rejected him, and then decided to go on this trip with him to obtain more glory after getting the glory of the Argonauts. And while she's there, she's like, oh, I should never have come. And I'm like, yeah, girl, you shouldn't have, because you turned this man down, and yet somehow you're still here. And the other thing she doesn't know at this point is that boar was sent by Artemis. So, like, in fighting this boar, she's directly fighting against her patron, and nobody points that out to her. Artemis points it out to her later on, but nobody really pointed out to Atalanta beforehand. And had she had that little bit of information, I don't think she would have gone, because Artemis is her patron. So in the attempt of trying to murder Atalanta, Meleager kills his uncles, which is also an escalation, but not out of character, because he's in love with her. So of course he would take the most extreme steps to protect her, because, like, in the back of his mind somewhere, he's like, I'm gonna somehow convince her to stay. She just has to see like how everything is here, and she'll stay. But now these guys are trying to kill her, so he has to save her. So he ends up killing his uncles. And what I thought was interesting about Meleager's character in particular is that he tells her that he is the son of Ares because his mom is so pretty that like all these gods are trying to like hook up with his mom, and he's the son of Ares. But there's a point in the story where they go to an island that is sacred to Ares, and he's nervous the entire time. So I kept expecting that at some point on this island, they were going to reveal that Meleager was lying about being the son of Ares, or that he wasn't sure he was the son of Ares, like something like that would come into play. It doesn't, but I thought it was so weird that like they kept talking about how anxious he seemed to be on that particular island that was sacred to Ares. It doesn't come into play. It's not relevant. But I thought that was a really interesting thing because it made me doubt like his claim to be a son of Ares. And then the boar itself is a symbol of Ares, and he ends up killing the boar. So like it seems to be like a sort of like here's a connection to Ares, but we're not going to actually like solidify that in your mind. Um, but what's interesting to me is that he's so enamored by Atalanta that he's like, yeah, I'm totally ready to throw away the entirety of my marriage and my whole life. I don't even care about that lady I have at home for this woman. And then when that woman rejects him, he's like, well, still keep hanging out with me, though. Like, come on this quest and murder this boar with me. Like, come stay by me because I'm pretty sure I'm going to change your mind. That's the impression I got from Meleager the entire time. I did like him as, like, a sort of romantic interest for Atalanta, though, because he genuinely respected her from the get-go. Like, he wasn't even toxic about it when he first encountered her. He was just pleasantly surprised and continued to be pleasantly surprised every time she did something. And not like in a I didn't think women could do that kind of way, but just like, wow, that's really impressive kind of way. So I really enjoyed Meleager, and it made me a little bit sad because when they go back home, his mom is so butthurt that her brothers got killed. She doesn't stop to ask him like his version of events or any part of that story. She just goes and murders him because he has this little like bit of firewood that the fates told his mom if it ever burned out, he would die. So essentially, as long as this little firewood is alive, he's kind of invulnerable, maybe a little bit immortal. Nobody really knows because he hasn't tested that theory, but like he can't die till the firewood gets burned out. But she gets so mad that she storms away before hearing his side of the story, even hearing the complete version of events. She's just like, yeah, murdered my brothers, storms away, and then she throws that log into the fireplace and he dies on the spot with his wife crying over him. So his wife was a character, and she was there, and Atalanta feels nothing for the woman. She doesn't even feel that bad about Meleager, and that's the point where I realized in the story, and I think also where Atalanta realized in the story, that while she felt some sort of connection to Meleager, she wasn't in love with him. She didn't have that like feeling of romance, that spark of romance, and I thought that was really interesting because at one point I was like, you must be doing all of this because eventually you're going to admit that you're in love with this man. She doesn't admit it. She's not in love with this man. And I was like, that's an interesting turn. I wasn't prepared for that. But then she leaves and she goes to return to the forest, but she can't really return to the forest of Artemis because she's pregnant. Because you can't have unprotected sex on a quest for months and months on end and not have that be the outcome. So she ends up being pregnant with Meleager's child, and Artemis doesn't punish her because she didn't break her promise. Her promise was to never marry. And Artemis almost was like, I'm going to get you. But she was like, the contract that we set up stated I wouldn't marry, and I didn't. So I was like, very clever way to work yourself out of that problem. And there's a point where Artemis is a little taken aback by the audacity, but she's like, I can't argue that. And that's where it became very apparent to me that the gods in the story are following very set standards of rules. And, like, if you break the rule, you're being punished. But if you don't break the rule, they can't really punish you, or they don't want to really punish you because the rule hasn't been broken. So, essentially, because she didn't marry, she manages to avoid this horrendous punishment. And Artemis lets her go. And I'm like, okay, cool. Now what? So what happens is she can't return to the forest of Artemis, but she stays close to the forest of Artemis because that's the place that she was abandoned as a baby. And it just, the only home she's ever known. And she ends up taking up residence with an old couple so that they'll take care of her child for her because she doesn't really want to be a mom. But she doesn't want to abandon her child on the mountainside the same way that she was, which I thought was very big of her. And I really appreciated that, like, little bit of information. So she ends up giving birth in this little quiet town with this poor couple. And she ends up helping them out and taking care of them, essentially, while they take care of her child. And she stays close to her child and in contact with her child, but not enough to form, like, a super strong familial bond because she's always in the back of her mind, like, I'm going to eventually leave when this child no longer needs me to be present. It's going to be their child. But then what happens is Hippomenes, who I didn't say, but he had also been at the hunt for the Caledonian boar, ends up tracking her down, telling her that basically the Argonauts are assholes, and that her father is now ready to claim her, because her father had abandoned her on a rock because he wanted a son, and they told him he wasn't going to have a son, and he was like, well, fuck, I don't want this girl child that either. So he left her in the mountains to be raised by bears, basically. And now he's like, oh, well, now that she's famous and cool, I want my daughter back. And that's where she's like, fuck that guy. But she's also like, makes a really interesting choice to go and get claimed by her father, to go get that, like, her proper titles as a princess back. so that she can set her son up for success. Because she's like, well, if I'm a princess, then he'll have wealth and he'll be fine and I won't have to worry about him anymore. And then I can finally leave my child without having to worry about his life, which I thought was really interesting of her, because she's not like invested in his life or like being a parent to him, but she's not willing to abandon him without making sure that he's taken care of or set up for it. And I was like, that's a really interesting, like, sort of balance between not wanting to be a parent, but also wanting to be a caretaker. Like, I thought it was really interesting. It was a really interesting, like, quirk to her character that I really admired. I really thought that was something to appreciate because she wasn't willing to fully abandon her child with nothing. So she was doing all this stuff to set him up so that she could go back to living the life she wanted to live. And at this point is where you sort of realize or pick up on that Hippomenes is in love with Atalanta. He's probably been in love with Atalanta since the day that she saved him from the centaurs and has been progressively trying to make himself a stronger, better man over the years, so that he can win her heart, essentially. But he doesn't want to do that, like, directly because he respects her. And at this point, we're, like, listening to their conversations, you know, between the two of them. I was like, oh, Hippomenes is down bad. And I actually really appreciate him for not being upfront about how down bad he is, just sort of letting it go and being a friend to her first. Which I thought was an interesting sort of juxtaposition between Meleager and Hippomenes, because Meleager was her friend, but then was like, we could hook up though. And they did. And then he continued to do that, where Hippomenes isn't willing to cross that line without her lead on the matter, which I thought was really interesting. And then basically we get jumped into she goes to her father's kingdom and they set up the foot race. And this situation happened so quickly, which is why I was like so shook at the end of the book with how everything is unraveling, because this boar hunt, the raising of her child, the foot race at her father's kingdom is all in the same, like, last 2 hours of the book. And I was like, wait. I want to hear more about her relationship with her father and, like, get some conversations between the two of them. And they don't really spend a lot of time with that. So when she goes back to her father's kingdom, he makes her prove that she's actually Atalanta from the stories. Then he's like, this is totally my daughter, and now I'm going to marry her. That was his whole plan. Her father's whole plan was for her to come back home, reclaim her birthright, and then immediately get married off in a powerful alliance that would benefit him. And he even lets her set the rule where, like, she'll only marry somebody who can beat her in a foot race. And he's like, great, cool. What if I made this horrific? Whoever loses to you dies, because I only want the best of the best to be attached to my name and my kingdom. That's the only thing he cares about. He doesn't really care about Atalanta at all. He just cares about the notoriety and the fame that it's going to gain him and whatever, like, promising match he can make from it. So, like, it seems like the very next day, I don't know how long it's been because we're going so quickly. All these, like, young men show up. They want to marry. They want to become a prince. You know, they want to become king of this kingdom. And all they have to do is beat this girl in a foot race. So immediately they underestimate her. They break the race up into 2 parts. So 12 runners on one day, 12 runners on the next day. And the guys that go first are, like, all 100% cocksure that they are going to be Atalanta. And she doesn't just beat them, she, like, disgraces them, because she lets them get to the halfway point and then outruns them after they pass the halfway point. And they're all shook because at the end of this, they're going to die. And they didn't, like, none of them thought they were going to die. All of them thought they were going to live, which to me is surprising, but not that surprising because the hubris of young men, right? But the thing that was really interesting to me about this part of the story is that Atalanta is horrified at the idea that they're going to die. Like, she heard that, but when she sees the reality of it happening in front of her as these men are being struck down or led up to the chopping block, she's like, what the fuck? I hate this idea. And she knows before the race starts that this is going to be a bad thing when they all lose, but she's not going to lose. Like, she's going to be damned if she loses to these guys, but she tries to give them an out and they don't take it. So then, during the race, when she's coming around at that halfway point and just outstripping them, she's like, fuck, I don't want these guys to die, but I don't want to lose. So she's sort of trapped in this, like, machine of her own design, right? Like, she can't escape it, because if she loses, she's stuck marrying one of these losers. But if she wins, all these guys die, and she doesn't want that. But there's no way for her to get out of it because she sort of talked herself into this situation. She thought she was going to have the upper hand by sort of putting her father in this position where he had to agree to this like foot race that she would never lose. And her father was like, your move, because I'm going to kill everybody who tries. And the first round of guys die. The second night, when they're waiting for the race for the next day, a lot of these guys are expressing their concerns. They're like, I don't really want to do this. One guy actually comes up to her, and I think it's sort of like a pity play where he's like, hey, I don't really want to be here. Could you help me? And she's like, I have no help for you. I can't even help myself right now. And she like has to deal with like those complex emotions, and she's talking them out with like Hippomenes, who's like, yeah, this isn't a great scenario. I'm worried about you here because you don't want to be in this situation. You don't even want to get married, let alone like let these guys die, but you have to keep winning because you can't marry these guys. And I think it's really interesting because Hippomenes, like, his character is portrayed as somebody who's always willing to listen to her perspective, where I don't think Meleager was willing to listen to her perspective so much as he was just willing to sort of be a sounding board for her and then be like, well, that's just not how the world works. But Hippomenes is absolutely willing to listen to what Atalanta has to say and her opinions, and he's like, okay, we have to come up with a solution because I don't want you to suffer. So the next day, they find out that Hippomenes did come up with a solution. He, in fact, went to the Temple of the Temple of Aphrodite, and he tells her basically that he's in love with, Atalanta. He wants to win this race. He wants to save her from this fate that she sort of trapped herself in. And Aphrodite gives him the golden apples of the Hesperides. And there's sort of like a compulsion aspect to it, because during the foot race, Hippomenes volunteers to join, and while they're running, as Atalanta is catching up to him, he throws a golden apple on the ground, and she is compelled to go look at it. She can't avoid the compulsion to pick it up and look at it, but it doesn't slow her down in the way that, like, you would think it is, because she's so freaking fast. Like, Hippomenes is never going to beat her in the foot race, but these apples, like, delay her enough and compel her to sort of look away enough that she's able to sort of see the bigger picture and realize that she kind of has feelings for Hippomenes. She doesn't want him to die. And as she's running, she manages to get distracted by the apples, but also regain some of her agency over the situation. And she's able to make the choice to slow down just enough that Hippomenes can win. So none of the guys have to die. And this is where I was like, I wish this section lasted longer, because I would like to see more of the development of the relationship between her and Hippomenes, because, like I said, at the end it feels very, very rushed. Even though Hippomenes does present himself as an excellent option, a perfect suitor, I just felt like there wasn't enough time. And I also wanted Atalanta to talk to her dad more about this situation. I wanted to pick the mind of the king a little bit and see where he's coming from, and how she responds to that. Especially in regards to just sort of executing these people. And from what I understood of the mythology, and this could be wrong, it takes a long time for anyone to win this race. It wasn't just 2 races and then we're done. She's doing it constantly, like over and over and over again, as like more men are coming in to try to claim some bit of glory from this. So it's like, it's not just, 12 guys that die and 12 guys manage to survive. It's like hundreds of dudes are getting killed trying to become the new king and the husband of Atalanta. So like, that's where I was like, oh wow, this went really fast. I don't know why like we rushed through that part or sort of diminished the impact that this proposal had on the nation as a whole, because I would have like thought that even some of the Argonauts might have come out there to just sort of see what was happening, like there would be some callbacks to that, but it didn't happen that way. We just sort of rush through this, and then the king demands that they get married immediately, and they have the wedding feast and everything without the married couple. So they get married, Hippomenes and Atalanta do, but they're like, all right, we're married, let's get the fuck out of here, because we're not going to get anything we want from this king. Clearly, he only cares about himself, and he only cares about having the upper hand, which is how he like ended up manipulating the foot race situation to his benefit. So, they leave, and while they're leaving, they just sort of leave behind the golden apples that were gifted to them by Aphrodite, which is where the sad part of Atalanta's story starts to take place, because she's finally found this like love, right? And there's a prophecy about her that once she gets married, that's incense ash, gross, that once she gets married, she'll never be the same. She'll be changed forever. And Artemis told her about this when she left for the Argo. So she's known about this forever. So she's like, okay, whatever. Like, I'm married now, no big deal. But what happens is they have these golden apples and they're supposed to return them to Aphrodite and be like, thank you so much. But they just freaking leave them and they're like, fuck those apples. We don't care about those apples. And while they're walking to go back home to, I guess the plan is to eventually get home, retrieve Atalanta's son and figure out what to do from there. They're overcome by lust, right? And as they're traveling through the forest, they find themselves at an old abandoned temple of Rhea, the goddess of the earth. And they're so overcome by their lust, which is what Aphrodite cursed them with, essentially, for scorning her gift of the apples and not doing the proper thanks and, praise of Aphrodite. They end up getting together, hooking up inside of Rhea's temple, and Rhea is not a dead goddess, or Titaness. She's not dead. She's still alive. Her temple has just been abandoned. So she's like, fuck you guys, how dare you? So she turns them into lions, and that's essentially how Atalanta's story ends. She gets turned into a lion, along with Eponymes, and they get to live the rest of their days as a lion. It's not a negative in Atalanta's eyes because she's finally free to be the huntress she's always wanted to be. She gets to go back to being with Artemis in the woods because Artemis welcomes her back as an animal. And, she gets to live the rest of her days as a lioness with her lion partner. She's happy. Everything's great. That's the end of the story. Wrapped it up. Done. And it's sort of an interesting thing. I thought we would get to see like a little bit of their lives together before they get turned into lions, but no, they married, they escape the castle, and then they are immediately turned into lions, and that's the end of the story. So that's like where the negative part of the story would be for me, because that last 2 hours, so much stuff happened, and I don't feel like we get to spend any time with it, which is why I was like, it's 4.5 out of 5. But it did not ruin my enjoyment of the story. I really like the story. I like that the story is sort of told not in a thing like, here are all the high points of her life and then this tragic ending, but sort of like, this is the facts of her life, and then the ending might be perceived as sad by some, but it's actually exactly what Atalanta wanted. She wanted to be free to be herself, which was a huntress in the woods, and by being a lion, she's essentially given exactly what she wants, and she gets to have the partner of her choice, which is Eponymes. I don't know if Eponymes is happy about it. I don't think he wanted to be a lion. He just didn't want to be treated as the unwanted child from his family and wanted to be loved by this woman. So I think maybe he's okay with it. I think he comes around to it eventually, but I don't know if this is the life he wanted or foresaw himself having. But sadly, the thing that stood to me as the saddest part of this is that afterwards, Atalanta doesn't get any benefits for her son. She doesn't get the thing that she set out for in the first place, which was financial security for her child. She doesn't get to tell the king he has a child. This child is now still stuck in this poor little village with his poor parents. And I didn't look up afterwards to see what happened to his son. I think he does do something afterwards, but I didn't look it up. I'm not really super familiar with what happens following Atalanta's myth, so that's probably something I'm going to research on later on. But yeah. That's essentially the entirety of the book, and my thoughts on it. I really enjoyed the book. I really enjoyed watching how Atalanta perceives the way that men treat women in this world was really interesting to me, because I could find parallels in my own life, and I could find echoes of her thoughts in my own head, but also that her thoughts weren't 100% exactly like mine. She has her own issues. She's not a girl's girl. And that really, really drove me crazy, but did not make me hate her. I didn't resent her for it. I was just like, please be one of us. Please be for us. But like I said, yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the story too, if you read along with me or if you've read it on your own. Let me know what you think for sure. And then, like I said, if you were in the book club, jump over and we'll continue to talk about it in the chat over there. Make sure you send me a message so I can put you in the group chat. And yeah, I think that's gonna be it for me, because this is a super long video. This is longer than I even thought it was gonna be. So if you made it to the end, I definitely appreciate your faces, and I will catch you guys all in the next one. I'm gonna wrap it up now because I don't have anything else new to add. And don't forget that we are reading Psyche and Eros next month. That's where we're going. It's Valentine's Day. It seems appropriate. And I've told this story, so if you're not familiar with this story and you don't know if you want to dip your toes into the little piggy pond, you can check out my storycraft, listen to the story, and then come back and see if you want to read this. I do. I'm going to be reading it. So we'll talk about this next month. And again, it'll be the same structure. I'm telling you guys about it now. I will do the review video at the end of the month, and then we will go from there. And I'll let you know what the next book is. But yeah, I appreciate your faces, guys. I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Until then, happy crafting. Thanks for reading. Bye.